Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Keisha Blain, and I'll be serving as the moderator. I'm currently an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and I serve as president of the African American Intellectual History Society. I'm so excited today to be joining two historians who I deeply admire, Professor Mary Frances Berry and Professor Jeanne Theoharis. I'm just going to provide a brief biography just for all of you, but I think by now everyone knows their remarkable work. I'll start with Professor Berry. She's currently the Geraldine R. Segal Professor of American Social Thought and Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches the history of American law and the history of law and social policy. She also advises students in African American history and legal history. She's the author of 12 books, including History Teaches Us to Resist and $5 and a pork chop sandwich, vote buying and the corruption of democracy. Professor Jeanne Theoharis is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College, CUNY. She is the author or co-author of 9 books and numerous articles on the civil rights movement, Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post 9/11 America. Her biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award, the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and it was also named one of the 25 best academic titles of 2013 by Choice. Her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, recently won the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize for Nonfiction. So it's truly an honor to be here today to have a conversation about organized protests then and now. I have a couple of questions, so I will start with those questions. But for those who are following along, you're welcome to submit your own questions using the Q&A feature. Go ahead and send your questions in. We won't address them immediately, but at some point toward the end, we'll stop and go through as many questions as we possibly can. So just to get things going, I thought it would be useful to start with a question that allows us to look to the past as we try to understand the current moment. To what extent does the current historical moment resemble or perhaps differ from other periods of history that you both discuss in your research?
Who are you asking?
So we can start with you, Dr. Berry, and then once you're done, Professor Theoharis can jump in and we can go from there.
I guess the most obvious thing is that we have a pandemic and we have an economic crisis that is as severe or more than anything we've seen in recent years in the United States. So in the midst of these twin crises, as it were, and both of them having a disproportionate effect on Black folk who are vulnerable, more vulnerable than other people. We have the police officer having the temerity, and I wonder how anybody can have the consciousness to have the temerity in the midst of all this to put his knee on somebody's neck, George Floyd's neck, and have other people observing, and to have it videoed, and to do that in the middle of all, talking about provoking people's own consciousness and a reaction. So that's the difference. The setting is different. The murder of unarmed Black people is not different. It has happened before, and we have had protests of various kinds and intensity over the years whenever it's happened, and it has not stopped because we all know that police officers enforce white supremacy and racial capitalism. That's one of the things they do. And so we expect that to happen. So this moment, with the reaction of everyone, one argument is that people can't go to school, they don't have a job, they're irritated, they see all this awful stuff happening, and immediately they mobilize and they go out and they protest. And so it is happening. And even while the protests are going on, other people are getting killed, which just makes it, compounds the problem, as it were, and it accelerates. So we've had accelerating murders and injury before. During the Civil Rights Movement, we had a constant string of things happening to people all the time. But here we have this happening in 2020 in the United States, and it seems never to stop. So I would point out those things as the most obvious differences and similarities.
So one of the things I've been thinking about, and I've spent many, many years thinking about, so I wrote this biography of Rosa Parks, and I spent years thinking about, because Rosa Parks has like 2 decades of activist experience, and she's really pretty burned out by December 1st, 1955, right? And I spent a lot of time trying to imagine what it's like to do something one day that you've in many ways done before, and then to sort of watch kind of history shift with you. And I guess I've been feeling a little bit like this moment has been showing me a little bit what that must have been like. And I guess, for instance, a couple weekends ago, Miriam Kaba, who's a long time abolitionist activist, community organizer, leader, had an op-ed in the New York Times. And I have to say, I never thought I would live to see that day. And just like all the work you do, and then I had emailed her to say sort of what I'm saying here tonight, you know, and what it's like to be in that moment. And she said she was terrified when the New York Times writes her and asked her to do the piece, right? Because, you know, she stood on so many shoulders, and how do you do that justice? And so to me, one of the things I've been thinking about is there's this accumulation period. There's this like all sorts of injustices coming together period. There's this, one of the things I read about in terms of Parks is that 4 nights before she makes her bus stand, she goes to a mass meeting because the killers of Emmett Till have been acquitted, and the lead organizer in the Till case has come to Montgomery. His name is T.R.M. Howard, basically to try to keep the movement going. So she is sitting with that acquittal that week when she makes her bus stand, right? And and many people are there that night. Many of the people who will become pivotal in the Montgomery Bus Boycott are there 4 nights earlier to hear about that acquittal, to hear about ongoing violence against civil rights activists in Mississippi. 2 had been killed. 1 had recently been assaulted again. This is November 27th, 1955. So I think one of the things I've been thinking about is that where accumulation, right, becomes a breaking point. And I think we're seeing that, and I don't think it's exactly a parallel, but I've been thinking a lot about the parallels between December 1st, 1955 and what we've been seeing for the past few weeks.
And Keisha, I just wanted to add something that I actually asked about. We were talking about it before we came on, and it's still in my mind. And that is that during all the protests that I have written about in History Teaches Us to Resist, and the ones I've been involved in over the years, all these years, we always understood that if you engage in nonviolent protests, you're likely to get arrested, and you're likely to go to jail, and you're lucky if the police don't beat you up, hit you over the head or whatever. And we were prepared for that, and we were trained for that, and we experienced that. And the whole civil rights movement did that. And then the movements that I've written about since then, everything from the pro-choice marches to, depending on where they were in the clinics, to things like the Free South Africa movement and all the rest, we knew that you could get arrested, and you knew that some harm could come to you. That was part of the risk you took. You put your life on the line, we said. There came in the student movement, in the Vietnam War movement that I was in. All those movements, we were accustomed. That's part of what nonviolence engenders, okay? in the 80s somehow, and in the late 70s, a lot of people got the idea that you aren't supposed to get arrested if you're protesting. And in recent years, it's been that if the police stop you or keep you from going where you're going or whatever, that you should object to that and make a cause out of the fact of what the police did to you, okay? We used to think if the police did something really awful to you, there would be visual images that would help to perpetuate and enhance the movement. But in the last few months, in this movement that is going on now, you've got violence again, and now people who go out and protest expect a certain amount of violence from the police again, rather than not expecting it. So I think that's really interesting. And it has become things like rubber bullets and other stuff, tear gas, and things that they weren't thinking about.
Yeah, and as we've been talking, this conversation is certainly making me think about some of certainly the strategies, but to an extent, it also makes me think about solutions. So even potential solutions as we look forward, what lessons might we be able to take from some of the early periods that you've mentioned, some of the research that you've done? If you had to boil it down to one or two lessons that I think all of us can take from this history, what would that be? And maybe Professor Theoharis can start.
Well, I think one of the things we're seeing now, and that I write about in terms, again, of the Montgomery bus boycott, is that like the way that movements are taught to us don't always resemble what it actually takes. And so I think in the kind of middle school version of the Montgomery bus boycott, you know, Rosa Parks sits down and then Dr. King leads this movement and it wins, and everybody walks for some amount of time and then it wins. And obviously you don't have a Montgomery bus boycott for more than a year just by walking. That in fact, what sustains that boycott is this incredibly well-organized carpool system. And I think one of the parallels we're seeing now is, again, the creation of that kind of, you know, textured mutual aid meets organizing, and that's the kind of work that needs to be done. And that's the work that it took in the past, right? And so I think part of it is learning the history of these movements, like how they actually transpired, right? So the work of Black women fundraisers during the Montgomery bus boycott, there were these kind of competing groups. One was called the Club from Nowhere, because in fact they were risking like even being associated with the boycott, and so they called themselves the Club from Nowhere, and they would have these bake sales and they would sell dinners. And then this other club called themselves the Friendly Club, and they would compete, and every week at the mass meeting, they would say how much they'd raise, right? So the work of fundraisers, right? So I think the second thing I guess I would say, and obviously in this moment, everybody doesn't have to do the same thing, right? Some people, for health reasons, for family reasons, are not going to be on the street. And that's true when we study, you know, the high points of these movements 50, 60 years ago, right? Everybody's not doing the same thing, right? But you don't get a Montgomery bus boycott to succeed without those fundraisers. You don't get a Montgomery bus boycott to succeed without literally these people, these dispatchers, right? The Montgomery bus boycott was doing 10 to 15,000 rides a day, right? So that there's a whole variety of work that movements take. And I don't think we learn that. And I think that deprives us of then how to imagine what to be doing today.
Well, I think that the lessons learned, first of all, persistence. Persistence is absolutely important if you wish to succeed. If you stop, because the people who you are protesting against, or the issues or whatever it is you are opposing, they all expect you to get tired and go away. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like on campus when they say the spring semester, students will be leaving soon, so we don't have to worry about it. They say, well, that movement's going to run out of steam. You know, they'll go away. You can't go away. Whether and social media is good for organizing and so on, and also for keeping under surveillance. Remember that. But somebody's got to be there, and somebody's got to show up. And you got to be persistent. When I think of the Nashville movement and Diane Nash and all those people, and how for days they sort of had this boycott and the protests in the stores in Nashville. And when the merchants got worried because Black people weren't going to buy anything for Easter, anything from the stores, and finally they were able to prevail. You've got to be persistent, and you've got to have a clear message. And if your message is not clear and it's not simple, then it won't resonate. But I think the most important thing that we've all learned is that if you give up, or if you can't sustain it over time, which is what I worry about the movement that's going on now, how long it can be sustained. Because if it's defined only in getting the Congress of the United States to pass some legislation about police, if you read the legislation from the House and the Senate, neither one of them is going to stop the murder of unarmed Black people. There's nothing in either one of them that's going to stop that. And until you deal with the underlying issues, then we won't have the kind of change we seek. So persistence, 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 and courage. That's the lesson that I've learned.
Thank you for that. And Kristen has asked a question that I just thought was great, and this is the perfect time to grapple with. The question is, what does history teach us about gender and the freedom struggle? What parallels and divergences do we see between the freedom struggles of the 50s and 60s and our contemporary moment? So can we talk a bit about gender?
Okay.
Would you like to jump in,
well,
Professor Berry?
About Rosa Parks, Jeanne, so. But gender, okay, I'll talk about it in a minute if you want me to. One of the issues in the movement, it was always an issue, and it's been an issue in every movement I've been involved in, and I write about a lot of them in the book, and I've been in a lot of them. The same kind of gender discrimination and the taking women for granted and assuming that women should have certain functions and not others takes place in movements. People always assume that women in any kind of committee or organization will be the secretary. I don't know if anybody ever noticed that, but I've noticed it for years. And so there's that. And when a woman exercises leadership, like Diane Nash in Nashville, or like Fannie Lou Hamer, or like any of the women, Rosa Parks, any of the women that we can talk about, or the woman I wrote about, Callie House, and the reparations movement, My Face is Black as Truth. Here she was running an organization in the late 1890s with thousands of people, and she was a woman, uncommon at the time. And there were people who tried to say she was not the leader and that a man who worked with her was the leader because they couldn't imagine that she could have been the leader. And there are people still trying to say that. So gender has been an issue. And we all know things like at the March on Washington where they didn't want women to speak. And it still happens today in most of the human rights and civil rights organizations. There are not women leaders of the organizations. So the NAACP, I don't think, still has a woman leader. There's been somebody who's been chairman of the board or whatever. But in actual movement circles, aside from these organizations, which do good work and sometimes they don't, when you're trying to develop strategy and figure out what to do in all ways, there are guys who question the women when they lay it out and say, here's what I think we should do. Sometimes they just ignore you and say, oh, well, and then they go off in the corner and talk and come back and say, yeah, here's what we're going to do. So that's a constant battle and a constant struggle. But if you want the movement to work, you have to figure out a way to ease the pain and get through it and have it move on. But it still exists. Think about it. Isn't it amazing that there are 3 women who started Black Lives Matter?
Right.
And
we almost seem to forget that.
And also there's a man who I will not name who goes around acting as if he started Black Lives Matter.
Only one? Only one?
Only one.
And I think part of this is kind of going back to this point we were talking about before, in terms of like, how do we understand what movements actually take, where they come from, you know, so that I think part of, we like these sort of flashpoint moments, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's you know, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and we tend to sort of not talk about where they come from and all the work that they take to get there, you know. And again, I think it's this, somehow somebody protests and then like a movement is born, as opposed to if we actually look at the work that movements take, right? Which I think then refocuses how we understand what leadership is and where leadership comes from. And certainly I think we get comfortable with certain kinds of narratives. So again, I'm going to just talk about Rosa Parks all the time tonight, as I like to do, but that I think one of the things that we have certain assumptions about what radicals look like. And so I think even most of us who thought we knew she wasn't a simple seamstress, I think hadn't realized there was this whole second half of her life, right, in Detroit, in Black Power, that have been really kept out of the ways that we celebrated and honored her. And again, as we've seen in the past few weeks, Parks and King have been rolled out to kind of chastise these protests again. Then you're just like, you have no idea, right? You know, Rosa Parks in 1967 is sitting on a kind of people's tribunal around police brutality. She's talking about policing, you know, from the 30s to the 90s. But because she's shy, because she dresses at times conservatively, because, you know, she is absolutely like going to church a couple times a week, that's not how we imagine what a militant looks like. And so then we get trapped in certain ideas about what leaders look like, what radicals look like. And I think it really misses the texture of kind of what movements take and what radicals actually look like.
It was that 1967 tribunal is where I first met Rosa Parks in person and sat and talked with her. And what?
Wow.
Wow. You never
and over the years, of course, I did talk to her a little bit, but that was when I first met her. It was after the Detroit riot, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Yes. The other thing I wanted to say was that the Free South Africa movement, people are always surprised when I tell them, and it succeeded. It's a movement that succeeded. It had a goal and it worked and it got what it wanted and it worked. We met every day at my house, the same house I'm sitting in right now talking to you, for a year and a half. Did you hear what I said? Every day. And we had protests every day during the week, every day, not only in Washington, but in other places. That's what I mean by persistence. And in the end, you can win like that, but you can't win if you're not persistent.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this conversation is making me think a lot about even earlier periods, you know, with my research. One of the things that I found striking was just, especially using FBI records, one of the things that was clear to me was that when federal authorities were trying to round up radicals, for example, in Mississippi, they were always looking for men, right? So that was to the benefit of the movement in many ways, because they would miss all of these women who were organizers, toiling. They would go into homes, even see these women and imagine, oh, well, that's just someone's wife or whatever. So who cares? Let's keep it moving. The irony is they would have encountered the person organizing the meetings. And so the gender politics just come up time and time again in these sort of narratives. So I'm hoping we could shift a bit to talk about voting. Because, you know, today, as people are trying to figure out how to move forward, a lot of people are emphasizing, of course, the importance of casting a ballot. This is an election year. It's very important that that we vote, that we all vote. But I do want to talk about electoral politics because I think my sense is that as important as it is, we also have to be mindful of the limitations, right, as we're thinking about how we transform society. So what are your thoughts, just generally, about electoral politics, especially in this moment as we're approaching November? So perhaps Professor Theoharis, if you'd like to start.
Well, again, to start with Mrs. Parks, right? So in 1968, she's part of a group of Black delegates in Chicago who refuses to sort of endorse anyone because they don't see any of the candidates really taking seriously Black issues. Out of that spirit comes Coretta Scott King's kind of push to what becomes the Gary Convention. I think we often forget that Coretta Scott King is really the initial driving force of Gary, that we tend to see it as Baraka and Hatcher. But this idea that an organized sort of Black convention, right, echoing conventions from the kind of 19th century, right, to make that it's not enough to vote, that it was absolutely about voting, right, but that it's not enough to vote if without being organized to make sure that candidates are kind of having to take seriously the issues. And again, I think since 2016, we now have this recognition that Black women, basically, both understood what Trump was, but also that, are pivotal to kind of any kind of Democratic Party success. But I think the key that we can learn from these movements 50 years ago is that it's not just about voting, it's about organizing around a set of interests and holding whoever we're going to be voting for to those interests. And that just voting is not enough.
Right.
Well, I guess I'm the iconoclast. Everybody's in step but Mary on this issue. I wrote a chapter in a book with John Blassingame called Long Memory, The Black Experience in America, and the chapter's called Blacks and the Politics of Redemption. And the point of it is that we worked so hard for so long to get the right to vote that we told ourselves that once we got it, if we just use the vote, we could change everything and we would move toward equality. And so many politicians and leaders told us that over and over again. Just go out and vote, and then you can get anything you want. Even Martin Luther King made that speech at the prayer pilgrimage, where he said, if we just get the vote, we don't worry about judges, we don't worry about governors, we don't worry about it, we just had the vote. Now, he knew better, because he was saying, aside from that speech, that and his own experience was that you had to engage in protest. So I always say that protest is an essential ingredient of politics. There are some things you can get with the vote, which is to get a few Black people appointed to jobs in the government, or get a contract, or get something. But the history of our people, if we know our history, and if we understand our history, we vote. We've been voting for the Democratic Party since Franklin Roosevelt's second administration. And yet most of the people where these people are being killed by police officers when they're unarmed, look at who is the governor, look at who is the mayor, look at who are the politicians. Also, look at things like after the recession, 2008, where all of these Black women lost their homes when their homes were foreclosed. And we couldn't get an executive order out of the administration. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I won't. But all I'm saying is that, yes, we have to vote. People fought and died and worked hard, and voting is important in a democracy. Unfortunately, we only have two parties. We need to change that architecture. It's not in the Constitution. But if you vote and you don't do anything else, then you will never achieve ending racial capitalism and ending white supremacy in this country.
Thank you for that. And so what gives you hope during this moment And what worries you most in this moment? Perhaps Professor Theoharis, if you'd like to start.
I mean, certainly what's giving me hope, and I think I was saying this before, is that some of the things that we're seeing, right, that we're having a serious conversation about defunding the police. That sort of arguments about sort of abolitionist arguments are getting a serious airing. I would not say I'm optimistic about sort of an abolitionist politics, but I think once you get a serious airing of an abolitionist politics, then defunding the police gets much more possible. Today, for instance, like a whole huge amount of academics joined with all sorts of other people in New York City to call for a $1 billion sort of defunding of the NYPD. Again, I don't know that I could have imagined that, 3 months ago, a year ago, that we could be having that as a serious sort of political possibility. That doesn't mean that we'll necessarily win that, but I think that's one of the things that gives me hope, is that I feel like the conversation we're having is different. What worries me is that we're also getting a lot of what I would say are things that are meant to perhaps placate us, right? So Aunt Jemima gone. Governor Cuomo gave us Juneteenth. But probably in the next couple of days, Governor Cuomo is going to defund all sorts of really important things, right? So what I worry about is how to balance important sort of what we might call symbolic, so the taking down of Confederate statues and colonial statues, and and getting a holiday for Juneteenth, if those are just ways to just placate us and not do any of the serious kind of, again, as Mary's using the term racial capitalism, like until we get to see some real things that help people materially, those feel somewhat pale, I would have to say. So I think that's what worries me, is that they're going to try to buy us off with a holiday, as opposed to kind of what we need.
Well, they will try to buy us off with a holiday or with anything else that can be a buy off and not anything really serious. They'll think of something else. But the thing that worries me, well, I'm optimistic because there's so many people who still think that it's necessary to do something and are willing to become informed and to try to push for the right things. I'm pessimistic for all the reasons that Jeanne gave, and because we're being pushed into thinking that we should put all our energies into preparing for the election, that if we just elect Biden, everything will be fine because our problems are just Trump. And if he goes away, then everything will be just fine. And there are many, many people who believe that, who seem to believe it. And if they believe that, and then they vote that way, and if they don't continue to support this movement, then we won't get the change we need. And so that worries me.
Keisha, what gives you hope?
Well, I think in a similar way, it is surprising in a good way to see us having conversations at the national level. As you mentioned, we've certainly been talking about defunding the police. It's not a new idea. The abolitionist perspective isn't new, as we know, but I don't think I've ever actually heard us talking about it at this level. And just like you, when I saw the op-ed from Myron Kaba in the New York Times, I think my mouth dropped. I thought, what in the world? The New York Times published this? Did they read it? But in all seriousness, and that was a moment where it was clear that we were at least having a conversation. My worry, of course, is that we'll just keep having conversations. When in 2015, after the Charleston massacre, we had a lot of conversations. 2017, after the the Right rally, we had a lot of conversations, and we're having a lot of conversations. But I just worry that will stay there. I mean, like, conversations matter and engagement. Certainly, I think people should engage ideas, and I think that's given me hope. But I would like to see us now shift from talking about abolitionist ideas to actually implementing them. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge we have to face. We have some really great questions just rolling in. Thank you to the participants. And so I'll jump into one that Casey is asking. Do you have suggestions for good educational resources to tell a truer, more complex story? And I would say, in addition to, well, certainly including your amazing work. And she's thinking specifically about resources for middle school and high school students.
All right, well, I'm going to start with an ad. So it's very exciting. Beacon is coming out with a young adult version of, like, I finally got to a place where I could see how to do a YA version of my Rosa Parks book. And so with YA novelist Brandy Colbert, like, we are coming out with that book in February. And it's meant for, like, kind of junior high and high school students. And the idea of it, so many of my students, I teach a civil rights movement class, civil rights and Black Power class, and so many of my students get to me and they're so mad. Like, why didn't I learn this before? And particularly with Mrs. Parks, right? Because they've learned about her. And so the idea of the book is, and then she's just such a great figure to tell a different history of the civil rights movement, because she's everywhere, right? South and North, 30s to the 90s, internationalism, anti-poverty, reparations, the whole 9 yards. So, okay, that's the ad. And the book will be out. It'll be called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks Young Readers Edition in February. And we had built a website a few years ago for teachers to teach Rosa Parks differently, and that's rosaparksbiography.org, and that's there. The first place I would say is the Zen Education Project. I mean, I think if you don't follow them either on Facebook or Twitter, right, every day they're putting, both they, kind of do it today in history, but they're really putting out fantastic materials about how to teach this stuff, about, primary sources to use in class. So that's the first place I would start. I don't know Mary, what you want to.
Well, I don't know that many books for middle school and students, to tell you the truth, but I will, and high school students, but I will tell you that a friend of mine was in despair over her niece who had no consciousness about the history of race or Black people or anything in the world, and who was in high school. And she said, what can I give her to read? She won't just read anything. So I told her to have her read Portraits of Black Women Who Changed America. It's a book. It has photographs in it, but it has stories in it. I Dream a World, it's called. Portraits of Black Women Who Changed America. And it's about all the different women. For somebody who's getting started and who doesn't know anything and who wants to engage, if they read about all those women, then I think that's a good start, which will send them on to wanting to read something else.
That's helpful, absolutely. And we have a question from Ursula, and it's, what narrative should we expect based on the past, what we know, of course, from past experiences, that the elites will mobilize to discredit the current rebellion? I'll repeat that just to make sure. What narrative should we expect based on the past that the elites will mobilize to discredit the current rebellion? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we already have some of them being put out and others developing. The first one is that they're looters and hoodlums and and all the rest of it, and therefore don't pay attention to them, put them in jail, whatever, trying to undermine America. The other is that they're trying to undermine America's heroes by talking about these traitors who should have their stuff taken down, monuments or whatever. And the third one is that if you would just, and I heard someone say this in a big ad on TV last night, if you would just put that energy you're putting into marching out there and go out and register to vote and then vote, your problems would be solved and you wouldn't have to do all this. Is America. You don't need to be out there doing all of this. And there are lots and lots of people who are pushing that narrative. So I think that all three of those are the ones, they push those all the time, every time there's any kind of protest, that you get it through the system and you go vote, do this, do that. And it's going to be the same narrative and it's being pushed out now.
I think one of the things I worry about, and I wrote some about the kind of civil rights movement in LA, and then what happens after kind of the Watts uprising, and sort of thinking about what happens there, and then looking at kind of mainstream media organizations now today. So one of the things that happens is there's this whole civil rights movement in LA before the Watts uprising that's getting covered as kind of this piecemeal thing. It's not getting covered as a movement like the glorious one in Birmingham, but it is being covered episodically. Mm-hmm. Then when you get Watts happening, what happens, it's like that nothing had ever happened. And then it's just like people are so angry, people are so alienated, people are on the streets, look at this, and like either negative or positive, but like a kind of erasure of all of that and no willingness to kind of go back as a media organization and say, how did we drop the ball? How did we not, we have this record of all these people who have been killed or hurt by police in the early 60s, in the LA Times, but then you don't see the LA Times doing some soul searching about the ways that they have not held power to account either. And I guess one of the things that I worry about here, there's a kind of newer, slipperier version of this. So you have the New York Times and all these, they're all making all these announcements. They're gonna hire different people and write different stories. But I think part of that has to be about going back and sort of saying we fell down on the job.
And I don't think that's gonna happen, Jeanne.
Yeah.
I don't either. I'm just saying this is one of the things that this is a worry, is that the ways the media, even media that is not partaking in the they're just hoodlums, then doesn't, that this is one of the dangers I worry about. But I don't think it's gonna happen either.
When the next thing happens, then the media will start covering the next big thing. We don't know what the next big thing is.
Right.
But that's the way it goes. So we can enjoy or not enjoy this moment.
Right, and we've already started to shift, right? Because now this week the focus is on Confederate monuments and statues, and it's certainly connected to a larger discussion about racism. But I do wonder, will we go back to talking about police violence, police killings, or will we sort of shift in a conversation about, as I think we mentioned earlier, just more and more symbols, and then perhaps shift our gaze far away from, certainly the issue that got us here in the first place to be having these uprisings.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And sort of Southernification. I mean, to me, the other danger of the Confederate, focusing on taking down the Confederate memorials, is there's a way that it makes it seem like this race problem is a Southern problem. When, as
Right.
Mary just said, right, most of these, many of these cities, right, are not Southern. Most of, and so to me, there's this kind of very slippery thing happening with how do we get the Confederate memorials back in here? Which is not to say we shouldn't be taking them down, but I worry about the kind of the ways that we constantly pivot to this old South. This is the problem, New York's not the problem, Minnesota's not the problem. Yeah, right. Sorry, Mary, I think you were about to say something too. No.
What did you say?
I thought you were going to say something. I thought I cut you off.
No, I was just going, yes, yes, yes. That's all. Yes, yes, yes. Because I looked it up, and I had my niece look it up, where the murders have taken place. Right. And it was my niece who told me, because she had looked it up. She said, do you realize, and she was angry, all of these cities where these people have been getting killed, they have Democrat. I'm a Democrat, she said. I vote Democrat all the time. And those are Democratic mayors and police chiefs and all that in those cities and those states. And then these people are getting killed. She said, I was thinking when I just first heard about it, it must have been some rotten Republican, that's what she said, who in fact didn't do anything or whatever. And these people, she said to me, why is it that you can have Democrats be mayors in these cities and we vote for them, and then how can we have this happen to our people? I don't know the answer. I think, well, I do know the answer. The answer is voting is fine, but you have to hold people accountable and you have to put pressure on them, and you can't just walk away after you vote and say, well, that was cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that actually connects to the question that Henry has asked, which is, given the general short attention spans and memories of many, in his words, unaffected white people, what strategies are needed to keep the current attention levels high? So what needs to happen so that we don't lose sight or fall right back into some of the, the comfortable kind of, places where we like to be, as we noted, to talk about Southern Confederacy and maybe talk about monuments, but how do we keep the attention and the focus where it needs to be?
One of the things I say in History Teaches Us to Resist is that if you have a movement and you're persistent and it's ongoing, you have to think of different strategies, because the media, after a while, people's attention goes away. In the Vietnam War, the first day a monk burned himself in the street, everybody's eyes were glued to, there's a monk burning himself, oh my God, we got to do something. On the fifth day, after the fifth monk burned himself in the street, people said, oh, another monk burned himself today. You have to change up, and you have to think of things to do, whether, as we did in Free South Africa, you had a big crowd, huge crowd one day at a protest and people getting arrested. Another day you had celebrities, that everybody knew. Another time you went and took over Shell Oil Company. You did things to keep the media. So I'm wondering who is strategizing and who is thinking in terms of trying to find some way to keep the protests going and to keep the media attention going when the next shiny object, comes along, before we get what we need. I think one end point is going to be, if some legislation is passed in the Congress, they're going to say, okay, well, now you got what you needed. You got something about police. So we have to struggle to think of strategic moves to keep the interest in the movement going.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was even thinking about the role of family members. And so someone like Sabrina Fulton, the mother of Trayvon Martin, just one example of so many. Even we can go back even earlier, thinking just recently, Sean Bell, who was killed by police in 2006, and his fiance, Nicole Bell, for more than 10 years, just kept talking about the problem of police violence and brutality in New York City, pushing for change. And whereas individuals, whereas we can perhaps shift our attention, today we're talking about George Floyd, or Rayshard Brooks or Breonna Taylor, maybe in another week we'll be talking about someone else. But the loved ones, they can't ever look away, right? It's something they live with day to day, and they'll never be able to escape it. And so in a way, when they continue to push the issue, and they continue to demand that we never forget, I think they play such a crucial role in keeping people focused on what matters. Did you want to add, Professor Theoharis, to that as well? I think we have time perhaps for one more question.
Yeah, no, let's go on to it. I mean, we can.
Yeah. Well, someone has a question here, and specifically, they're responding to an interview you gave, Dr. Berry. So this is a fan of yours who's pulling up an earlier interview. But in that interview in 2018, they note that you were pointing out that one of the most significant obstacles to, and I'm quoting, I believe this is a direct quote, to the success of valid, aggressive social movements in general policy changes is the vulture capitalist. Could you say more about that, especially in the context of today? Well, perhaps whether your thoughts have shifted any since that interview, and if not, can you tell us more about the
Wow, did I
role?
say that?
Yeah.
My goodness.
Right. That's what I said. I believe we're quoting directly, according to Eric.
Well, I don't know half of what I say most of the time anyway. But in any case, you were mentioning earlier, Keisha, was it Joy? Somebody, Jeanne, about the Aunt Jemima and all that. That was Jeanne, I think. And in fact, you have all of these capitalists now, of course, in these companies giving money. There's an announcement every day about how much money they gave.
Oh,
And
I know.
if you look to see who they're giving the money to, okay? The money to Black colleges goes to Morehouse and Spelman, who have more money than the other Black colleges already, okay? The money for the capitalists that they're giving to human rights organizations, they don't give it to grassroots organizations in New York City and in all these cities where these things, they give it to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, whose board I'm on, so I can say this anyway. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, they give it to the NAACP. They don't even think about, and some people have come to me and asked me who they should, from these capitalists, who they should give money to, and I tell them some other grassroots organization. They said, well, nobody will have heard of them if we give them some money. But if we give the LDF, we can put an ad in the paper and say that we gave them the money. Give it to the ACLU. Give it to all kinds of big organizations, all right? And not the grassroots. What we don't realize as a people is that what they're doing is giving us that so that we continue to buy stuff from all of them. That's one thing. They want us to continue to be customers. And they get a tax deduction for the contribution that they're making. It's not like they're giving money away to somebody. And if they want to give money that can be directed and used by the people who need it for the programs we need, they should set up a super fund like the reparations super fund. Or they should support reparations, which we haven't mentioned, as an option. And maybe more people will do that. But vulture capitalists are people who do all the things that I have described and much more.
And Professor Theoharis, would you like to have the last word here?
I mean, I agree with like the kind of number of coffee shop, coffee chains who are giving to LDF and as the kind of symbol of their commitments. And again, we need people, giving money, but like Mary's saying, it seems a lot about just their image, not actually about the work.
Right.
I think if I'm going to get to have the last word, I think it's going to be going back to what Mary was saying about persistence and perseverance. And again, going back to kind of, I feel like what I always sort of see is like summoning our inner Rosa Parkses, right? Which is that one of the things that's kind of also amazing about Rosa Parks is not just like she works for 2 decades and then finally history moves, is that then she keeps going, right? And she's just doing stuff and and what it means to just hold that vision in moments where, you can't necessarily see where you're going. I don't know. So I guess just to go back, I guess where I wanted to end was just back at this place of perseverance and what it takes just to kind of keep doing things, right? And not necessarily always be able to see the end. Because again, I think, as most of you know, my sisters Liz Theoharis and Reverend Barber and are organizers of the Poor People's Campaign. And one of the things that Reverend Barber said at their big event this weekend, right, is that our danger is to sort of think too small, to ask too small, to demand too small, right? And part of that is that I think part of the perseverance point that I think Mary was making too is part of perseverance is being able to imagine farther than you can like then you can actually see, right?
You can also, even though she had the last word, you can also
Okay.
keep in mind that even if you don't get everything you're trying to get, that, as I often say, that each generation has to make its own dent in the wall of injustice. And at least you can make a dent. How's that?
Yeah, that's key. Well, I just want to thank you so much. Thank you both for an amazing discussion. And thank you to everyone who came out this evening to join us for this conversation. Please do, if you haven't already read the books that I mentioned earlier, please do pick up a copy. I think the work that Professor Theoharis and Professor Berry are doing is just quite remarkable and inspiration, I think, even for my own work. So I really hope that you take the time to read and engage their work. And thank you all again for taking the time. Have a good evening, and we hope to connect with you in some other way, and stay safe out there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.